Welcome to the Linux Spotlight. This show is dedicated to showing off the best thing about Linux, our community. This community is made up of developers, distro maintainers, YouTubers, and everyday users. Each one plays a vital role in our community, and the goal is to have a discussion with each individual about their journey into Linux and beyond. So join me now as we turn the spotlight on. Hello, I'm your host, Rocco, and with me today, our special guest is Nate Graham.
Hi there.
Nate, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty great. How are you, Rocco?
We're going to talk about Linux, and we're going to talk about KDE, so it's a good day.
Sure is. Always is.
All right, dude. People will undoubtedly know you from your work with KDE Plasma. You have a blog that you update us on all of the updates, features, and bug reports and bug fixes on KDE Plasma development. But that's where people will see you from and say, yeah, that's Nate. But what if they were to come up to you and ask you, who is Nate Graham personally?
Well, outside of my Linux work and before my Linux work, I was pretty much a nobody, just an ordinary person. I mean, I'm married, I have kids, I have a house and a car, and before I became employed to work on Linux stuff full time, I just had a regular ordinary tech job. So, that's the real me. I think ultimately, no matter who our public persona is, pretty much all of us are just regular people under the surface.
So you are a human being living on Earth just like everyone else.
Shocking, but true. Imagine that, right? I'm actually not a clone, an alien, a super powerful AI. Not that either.
Yep. All right. So what is it that you do for your day job?
Well, actually, my day job is working on KDE stuff, which is an amazing blessing, honestly. I have been working at my current job at a company called Blue Systems for about a year and a half now. And as this job, I am the QA manager for various internal KDE-related projects and in a de facto way for KDE stuff itself. So it's amazing. It's like the best job I've ever had. I love it.
Well, it's awesome to be able to have a job that you can do what you love to do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So before you worked for Blue Systems, KDE was your hobby. Linux was your hobby. Now it's incorporated into your day job. What about other hobbies now?
Yeah, obviously KDE used to be my hobby, and it gradually swallowed up all the other ones. So I mostly do that. But my wife encourages me always to branch out, to get back to my roots a little bit. I'm a huge nerd, as most of us are. So I really like board games. I like tabletop role-playing games, especially those using the White Wolf system. I like playing Warhammer 40K. I have a nice sizable orc army that I've modeled and painted up. Haven't actually gotten to play in a while due to COVID, which is sad, but I do enjoy the modeling and painting aspect. It's nice. It's sort of meditative, to do something physical, something artistic when I spend a lot of my day doing technical stuff. Aside from that, I like gardening and home improvement. I'm currently working on renovating a shed in my backyard to turn it into my office. Right now, I don't actually have an office, which is sort of problematic sometimes. I work from my bed. I work from the kitchen table. Whenever I do video chats with colleagues, they always see me with like the headboard of my bed behind me, and they're like, "Oh, wow, Nate, this is the place where you work, right?" And I say, "Well, right now, it's just because I work from the bedroom when I need to close the door so that the kids don't come in."
Yep. Well, it's always good to have a space, an office that you can go into and work, and
Yeah. I look at yours right behind you. I'm jealous. That looks pretty nice.
Well, looks can be deceiving, but
but that's all I can see. So that's what I assume is reality.
Yep. All right. So I mentioned in the beginning that you have a blog, and that has a name of PointedStick.
It does.
And you have that username like all over the place, but some of it's a variation of that username. Is there an origin story behind you picking that?
Yeah, I was like upset when I couldn't use PointedStick on Reddit. That's why I'm Pointiest there, because I'm pointier than whoever took that one. But anyway, so the origin story is like kind of it's sort of a retcon a little bit. The original story of this name was that it is a meme reference to a Monty Python sketch. There's this famous Monty Python sketch where I think John Cleese is teaching other people how to defend themselves. It's like a self-defense class. And he will only teach them to defend themselves against pieces of fruit. You know, somebody armed with a banana or with a bunch of grapes, and the students are very dissatisfied, and they keep saying, "Oh, this is unrealistic. When are you going to teach us how to, defend ourselves armed with, something else? What if he has a gun? What if he has a pointed stick?" And then John Cleese goes, "Shut up!" Eventually, ends up. It's. I won't ruin the end of the sketch because it's really funny. You should look it up. Defend yourself against pieces of fruit. But anyway, it was just a reference to that Monty Python sketch, and nothing more. Until I became involved in KDE, and I found myself being the person who like follows up on things and bugs things and like pokes them and says things like, "Hey, what happened with this? Can we keep going on it?" And so people started to say, "Oh, so that's where your username comes from, right? You just poke everybody with a pointy stick." And so then I would say, "Yes, obviously that's what it is."
Of course it is.
Yeah, definitely. So it became a sort of a retcon, right? Like originally it was this Monty Python thing. Now this is my role, is to poke people with pointy sticks.
It's fantastic. I love it.
I do too. It was perfect. It was fated.
Yep. Perfect for you. Well, you work on Linux. You probably spend a lot of your spare time on Linux. The people you interact with, Blue Systems, KDE, they all know about Linux.
Mm-hmm.
What about your other family, friends, your other part of your life? Can you talk to them about Linux like you can for KDE people, or do their eyes glaze over after you start talking to them?
I feel pretty lucky in this respect because there are a lot of people in my life who I can talk about Linux to, some more than others. But for example, my wife actually uses Linux. She uses KDE Neon, a Plasma-based distro. And, so I can talk about this stuff with her. She's more of a user and not so much on the, techie developer side, but I rubber duck with her all the time. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, this is not some kind of kinky sexual thing. This is when you talk about what you're working on implementing with another person, and in the act of talking about it with them, you have like a better idea or figure out a problem you were trying to solve. So yeah, like I can talk about it with her. I can talk about it with a couple of friends of mine. One of my friends uses Linux. He's on Mint right now, but he's about to switch to Plasma, which I'm excited about. He wants me to help him with that. So,
nice.
So I'm going to hopefully do that maybe a little later today or some other time this weekend. My parents do not use Linux, but they are just sort of, proud parents and interested in what I do. So I can talk about it with them too. And yeah, I feel really very happy that I'm not isolated in this. It doesn't make me like a social pariah or anything.
Right.
I guess it would be kind of weird if it did, but it doesn't.
It's good to have that support group of people around you because some people don't. And that's definitely a benefit to it.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
All right. So we're going to get into, deep technical Linux issues later. But let's start with the general computers in your life.
Mm-hmm.
What was the first computer that you remember using, and when was that?
So the first computer I ever used was actually my own computer, which was given to me by my grandfather, who was a very sort of forward-thinking person. He anticipated that the world would be all about computers, so he bought an Apple Macintosh LC3 for all of his grandchildren, and I received one. And it was a pizza box Mac. Big and flat. You can look it up. It totally looked like a pizza box. But I love this computer. It was great. It was just the perfect thing for a kid. It was very user-friendly. I could play games on it. I could do art with it. I actually have not always been really a super technical person. I mean, I do some development stuff now, but it's all very recent. For most of my computer time, was like more of a visual person, an artist. So I made all this 3D art on my various Macintosh computers that I owned over the years. But that LC3 will always have a fond place in my heart.
All right. So there's a time span when you first got that. to where you get to where you hear about Linux. So
Yeah.
how does that all play out?
So for the longest time, I actually did not hear about Linux. My first computer, that was, I think, the year 1993. And it was only a few years later that Linux would actually be, I mean, Linux itself was just invented the next year, I think. And then the desktop environments came a little bit later. But I came to Linux later myself, was in college. I can't remember how I heard about it, but somebody told me about Linux in college. And, we all do crazy things in college, right? All of these wild and crazy things our parents don't want you to do. And my wild and crazy things was I installed Linux. I had this Mac laptop and I put Linux on it. And at the time, Mac laptops were PowerPC based. So I put, I recall its name was like Yellow Dog Linux, something crazy like that. And it was like a flavor of Ubuntu that would run on PowerPC processors. So I put it on my laptop and I was amazed that it worked. Like, this thing actually worked. It was a totally free operating system made by random volunteers and, I guess canonical, but I didn't really know any of that at the time. But it was just like really cool in this sort of techie nerdy way that like I had put another OS on my computer. I didn't end up actually using it. I like abandoned it. I put it on another partition and just saw it as like a fun tech hobby. And I kept using Mac OS because I was a big fan of Mac OS at the time. Still sort of am, even though, the where it's gone is sort of another story, but that's my origin. But so at that point, the seed was planted. I had used this Linux distro, and it would just sort of sit there in barren soil until much later in 2012. At the time, I was working for Apple. I had gotten that job out of college, and I was starting to think about what I really wanted to be using in my own time. And so even though I used a Mac at work, I started to use Linux on my own time. And I bought a PC and I put Linux on it. Linux Mint, if I recall, it was a good distro. I liked Linux Mint quite a lot. And I used that full time at home. When I wasn't at work, I used Linux, and it just like, it all worked, basically. Everything was fine. And I used this to run a small business that I had at the time. I actually was really into 3D printing during that era of my life. And I had built some 3D printers, and I started selling parts for 3D printers and selling printed parts. And I ran all of these machines off of my Linux Mint computer. So it was a business machine as well. Wow. It totally worked. It was like a very small print farm that I had. I had 3 printers max. And man, that was another story. That was a fun part of my life. But technically I was running a business on Linux, and it worked perfectly. There was nothing the matter. Everything worked fine.
Well, I want to go back to something you said, and you said you don't remember who told you.
I don't.
And it's funny because we think about, talking to people about Linux and saying, hey, you got to run Linux. But really, nobody was shoving it down your throat. It was just, they planted the seed and let it go. And I think that's important.
It was just there.
Yep. It's important for us today to, use that same approach and not try to jam it down people's throats.
I agree. And this goes for everything in life too. I mean, whenever you're trying to convert another person to your viewpoint, the harder you do it, the less it works.
Yep. All right. So you mentioned about Linux Mint. You ran it. What about the good things and the bad things back then about Linux Mint? Like when you installed it, was everything working? Was everything not working, or what?
Everything was working. That was honestly what I liked most about Linux Mint, is I would install it. It had a nice installer. The installer worked. There were no weird bugs. It installed media codecs, so I could play all of my music. For those of us old fogies who actually have, MP3 files on our computers, right? Yep. Nowadays, everything's like Spotify and YouTube music and stuff, but that was a big deal for me. It had media codecs. I didn't have to figure out how to install them. Everything else worked. I mean, for the most part, it seemed like a complete operating system where it didn't have any major oversights or flaws. One thing I really remember in particular is how well the input stack worked. They had very early support for libinput, I recall. And libinput is an input library that is especially nice, in my opinion, for touchpads. And like in Plasma, we didn't have support for that until just like a year and a half or 2 years ago. It was not great. It was like a major oversight. Like you would use Plasma and you'd be like, oh, this support just is not there. Like you could use it, but there was no configuration UI for it. And Linux Mint had that. They had configuration UIs for everything. It felt like a really cohesive, well-designed system. and I was very happy with it. The reason why I ultimately left Linux Mint was I was sort of forced to, because every single time I had to upgrade that computer, it broke without fail every time.
Wow.
And I went on the forums. I was like, hey, my install broke. And what I came to understand was that this was just like an architectural deficiency of Linux Mint, because everybody had broken installations. In fact, my friend who I mentioned earlier, who's on Linux Mint, who wants to move to Plasma, his reason, he upgraded and it broke. So it's like there's something about the way this distro works where upgrades just are not functional. And I think they even sort of admit this, because when you look at their literature on this, they're like, hey, here's this new version. Here's this flashy, glitzy page that tells you all the great stuff. Get really excited. Look at all the amazing new stuff in it. And then at the end, it's like, but maybe you shouldn't upgrade if you're happy with what you've already got. And it's like, come on, man. You can't show me all of that cool new stuff and then say, don't upgrade. And
Right.
like, we all know why that don't upgrade there is because they know that like upgrades don't work. You have to do like a clean reinstall. And I just got tired of that because I wanted the hot new stuff. You know, I looked at their stuff and I thought it was great and I wanted it and I couldn't get it without breaking my system. And didn't work.
Yep. What are you going to do? I have had upgrades that have worked, but I have had many upgrades that have not worked. So yeah, that's an issue.
It just seemed like, I don't know, somehow.
The best thing I always tell people is just do a fresh install.
Yeah. That was what I did. And that gets old fast.
Yep, it does. All right. So do you still use Windows or Mac in any way?
So I don't have any Mac computers anymore. I do have a Windows computer that sits in my living room as a sort of family media center PC. Basically, it shows YouTube. It's just connected to a TV. It's kind of a dumb thing. But I do use it for playing games. There are some games that I and my children and my wife have that don't run on Linux yet. So, so that's that. But if every single one of those games ran on Linux, it would have a Linux-based OS on it tomorrow. That would be it.
Yep. All right. So you seem, focused solely on KDE Plasma, but that's right now. Mm-hmm. Was there a time when you did a little distro hopping?
There was. So the history of how I come to be where I am right now is that after I left Apple in 2016, I decided that I wanted to move to Linux full time. It was like an ideological thing for me. I really wanted to do it for, reasons that I can get into later if you're interested. But when I started with this process, I didn't know really anything about Linux. And I'd used Linux Mint before, but being dissatisfied with it because of the upgrade breakages, I said, well, I want something else. And I should probably choose deliberately. I should actually do some research and find the thing that best matches me. And at the time, I was still a big Apple person, and I wanted to find sort of the most Apple-like distro, the most Apple-like environment. And I actually didn't manage to find Elementary OS first, but I did manage to find GNOME. And I'd heard that GNOME was very Apple-like, very consistent and polished and all that stuff. So I installed GNOME with Fedora because I'd heard that Fedora was the best way to get GNOME. This is before Ubuntu switched to GNOME. And I used it and I really liked it overall. I mean, again, like with Linux Mint, this Fedora with GNOME environment was it was an amazing thing because it actually worked. It was a totally functional environment and I used it. But the more I used it, the more I kind of started to chafe against it a little bit. I found little workflow things that I didn't like. And so I installed extensions to add those things. I installed an extension to add a dock that you can see. And I installed an extension that makes the system tray go in the top bar instead of that little thing in the side. Keep in mind, This was all a few years ago. I don't know if they've changed it. But I installed all these extensions to make it behave the way I wanted. And I found that the more extensions I installed, the less stable it became. It started crashing. It used tons of memory. Battery life on my laptop was not good. And so I started filing bugs on this. And, I will say I often did not get a very friendly response in the bugs that I filed. What's funny is now I actually have a little bit more sympathy for GNOME's developers. At the time, I was sort of upset by this. But now what I realize is that a lot of the bugs that I filed were things that GNOME's developers have heard from users for years and years and years. And they're just sick of hearing about it. I filed a bug about lack of type ahead support in Nautilus, for example. When you type text in Nautilus, it gives you a file search. And I was I don't want a file search. I just want to search among the files here. So I filed a bug and I got a really curt reply. And of course, I later found this was one of the number one most complained about things. So Gnome's poor developers have gotten like endless user abuse over this. So they get a new bug report and they're like, oh my God, here we go again.
Yep.
And I didn't know I was walking into that minefield. And it's like, I can totally understand that now. But on the other hand, it was annoying, and I had bad experiences. I did not have the kind of positive experiences interacting with the developers that I was looking for. And so I moved on. I moved on to XFCE, and I just found it to be like too buggy. It looked kind of old fashioned and it was just like really buggy. And then I moved on to KDE Plasma on OpenSUSE Tumbleweed because I'd heard that OpenSUSE was like a good distro for KDE. And it just clicked somehow. It just like it worked. It felt like the right environment for me. And what I later came to realize was that the reason for this was because I wanted an environment that would adapt to me rather than the opposite. Because, I had a workflow that I was comfortable with. And I found that Plasma really did not impose any expectations of workflow on me. It accommodated what I wanted to do and how I wanted to use the system. It was just like, okay, go ahead and do that. You do that. And it
Right.
was like, now I will say when I started using this, it was buggy like XFCE was. And it was like super visually unpolished. There was like all these little glitches all over the place. But I said to myself, you know what? This I can live with. Like the functionality is there. These bugs and glitches I can live with. And moreover, I bet I could actually help to fix these in a way that like maybe I couldn't fix deeper architectural issues or like political issues where it's like a decision that, a maintainer has made.
Right.
And so I started filing bugs. I filed bugs on KDE stuff, and I got generally really good responses from the developers. They were like kind and considerate, and like some of them fixed the bugs right away. Some of them encouraged me to fix them myself. And even though I really was not much of a developer, I found like some small things that I could do, and I started fixing them. And it was just like a much better social experience overall, really, to be welcomed into this community. And I felt like I was essentially. They welcomed me rather than like treating me with suspicion or something.
Right. Well, you mentioned about switching over from GNOME to KDE and how it allowed you to use your workflow. Were there any standout features that you can talk about that say, hey, this is one of the things that I loved about it when I came over?
Yes, absolutely. That feature is KRunner. KRunner is a like revolutionary, amazing, game-changing feature in my opinion. It's basically the Plasma equivalent of macOS Spotlight, which for those of you who are not aware of it is a system-wide search, app launcher, calculator, unit converter.
Do everything.
It can do anything. You type anything you want into Spotlight and it gives you what you were looking for by magic. And KRunner has the same magic, but even more. It has more stuff in it. It's like even better. KRunner even has like it has so many features. You find new ones randomly. There's this new one that I just started using recently, web shortcuts, where if you type in like wiki something, wiki : something, it'll search Wikipedia for that because it has like a keyword for that. You can search Amazon to like go shopping. You can do image searches for various different search engines, and it has tons of them. And you can add your own too. It's like just so cool. Now, I'll mention that GNOME has a similar thing. In their activities overview, they have a very similar feature, but it's just like not as powerful as KRunner. It can't do all the same things, and it only shows you like a few search results and so on. Before I get too much further, I do want to mention that I'm really not trying to bash GNOME here. I used GNOME for a while. I really like GNOME, and I think GNOME is great at being GNOME. But what I discovered personally was that that thing wasn't for me, essentially. I'm sure it works really well for lots of other people, but it didn't meet my needs. It's not bad. It just didn't meet my needs, and Plasma did. So that's why I'm using that.
Yep. And I think that's the great thing about Linux is that we have that choice.
Yeah.
But what about, you mentioned workflows. Do you have a specific workflow or do you have a specific set of software that you install on, say, a fresh install?
I have a very email-based workflow in a lot of ways. Because of what I do, I'm pretty much like a QA manager sort of person. I have a kind of 10,000-foot view of everything and feel broadly responsible for making sure that the quality is high. So accordingly, I subscribe myself to like every repo. I read every bug report. I triage all new bugs that come in every day, that sort of thing. And most of these things come in through email. So the first thing I do is I fire up my email client, and I usually have like 200 to 300 emails in the morning.
Oh, why?
It's a lot of emails, and they're mostly actionable too. So what I'll wind up doing is I'll, read and then delete a subset of them, and the rest of them will stay open, and I will open them up in web browser tabs because they all almost invariably, have a link. So then my web browser tab list becomes my day's to-do list. And I go like from right to left, knocking out tabs, working on stuff, triaging bugs, fixing tiny issues, following up on things, that sort of thing. While I'm doing this, I will also be in various internal KDE chat rooms where I'll be corresponding with developers, notably our visual design team, which is a very active team in KDE. And there's lots and lots of visual discussions, especially right now because we're working on improving the visuals of our default app themes. So there's a lot of discussion there that I participate in while I'm doing this other stuff. Then once all that stuff is done, which often tends to settle down in about the afternoon my time, because I'm in the USA, it's about 8 hours later in Europe. So when it's like, noon, 1 or 2 p.m., people are starting to wind down in Europe. They're like going to sleep. So that's when I get a break and I can start working on development stuff. And for that, I've got my text editor, which is Kate, amazing editor. I love Kate.
Yep.
I've got my terminal, which is console, which is likewise amazing, except for the lack of text reflow, which is coming. There's actually a patch. Everybody who hears this and uses console is amazingly excited right now. It's totally happening. Groundpole 2012, it's happening. .gif,
Nice.
Yeah, so that's what I do. As for like communications apps, what do I got? I got Telegram. I use Element, which is the rebranded Riot. That's for Matrix stuff.
Yep.
I use Discord for internal work stuff. We use Discord for that. That's about it, really.
All right. Well, what about software that is not available on Linux? Is there any that you would like to have in your workflow that's not available?
So outside of workflow, there are some games that would help me and my family move entirely to Linux, as I mentioned earlier. But workflow-wise, I got to admit, the app I miss the most is Apple's Pages. I loved Apple's Pages. It's a competitor to Microsoft Word. It's like a word processing semi-page layout app. The thing that makes Pages so great is that it allows you to produce documents that are incredibly beautiful, almost without effort, because it has a really great built-in assortment of like colors and color schemes and themes and styles and backgrounds and borders. This may sound silly, so let me give an example. So like when you insert an image into your document, there's an option to draw a border around the image, right? So Pages includes all of these really rich, like almost procedurally generated borders. One of my favorite ones was the sticky note border, where it makes the image look like it's like a Polaroid, complete with a thumbtack on the top. So it's like you've thumbtacked an image into your document. I mean, some people, I guess, would think this cheesy. I thought it was great. I love this. And there were tons of other things like that. Whereas by contrast with LibreOffice, which is what I use right now, which I'm generally happy with, when you put an image in LibreOffice, the borders that are available are like these things that they had in the 1980s. It's like dotted line, cross-hatched line, dotted, and then other kind of line. It's like, come on, man. You haven't updated this since like 1983. Jeez. And so I feel like that kind of app where the allowing users to create something with a visual presentation is really great, is something that we need a little bit more of in the Linux world.
Well, I think that is definitely something we need. We need more balance, having it be visually nice and still functional. So a lot of people are interested in having it functional, which is understandable. And there are a lot of Linux users that don't really care about the visual part of it. But I think we definitely could use some more balance in that area to make it, up to date, to make it look nice.
Well, I see it as kind of like you build a house, right? You can't have a house without a foundation. The functionality is the foundation, so you need that. But on the other hand, if your house is just like a foundation and some basic walls and it doesn't look pretty, nobody wants to buy that house, even if it would last for 1,000 years because it's well built. And it's sort of the same thing with our software in the Linux world, where like we need to start out with the good functionality, but you have to pay attention to the presentation, or else a lot of users are just not going to consider it. Because when you think about how people evaluate software, most people are not that technical, right? People don't already know what the features are of the software if they haven't used it yet. So you fire up a new app, and what do you see? You see how visually polished it is. You see how good it looks. And so if you're not familiar with the app or you're not very technical, that becomes a proxy for the rest of the app. Even if it's very powerful, if you open up an app and it looks like garbage, you're going to think, oh, this must be terrible. Obviously, the developers have not invested time into what matters, so I bet it's buggy as heck too. And maybe that isn't true, but that's the impression that you're giving if your app doesn't look good. So I think it's so important that apps look presentable. The bar is higher today than it was before, and we got to meet that.
Well, I think the apps are really important. Like, for example, KDE itself, when you install it fresh, it looks beautiful. There's no question about that. But we definitely need some improvement with the apps as far as making them not just visually nice, but like you said, allow people to have that opinion of that app. Man, I really like that. That looks really good. And you kind of endear yourself to certain apps just because of that.
You do. You fall in love with a beautiful app.
Yep.
Even if you're the kind of person who wouldn't want to admit this, you totally do it. We all do. And I completely agree with you. We've put a ton of effort into making Plasma itself look more beautiful over the last few years, but we have not done as much for KDE's apps. Frankly, it's harder. KDE's apps use a C++ based theming system, which is challenging to work on. That said, we're working on it right now. We have like a big overarching task that I call Breeze Theme Evolution. And we have a ton of mock-ups made by really talented designers, some of whom are like outrageously young too. I'm like amazed at how incredibly young some of our newest visual design people are. We have people who are like 15 years old, 16 years old, 17, 18 years old, and they produce this incredible output. And so they are helping us to refine the visual style of our apps in a way that I entirely agree with you is much needed. Even if the power is there, the visuals are quite clunky, and we're aware of it and we're working on it.
Right. Well, let's go back to when you started with KDE and the project. How did you get involved? Like, how do you go from being a KDE guy to a person that works on it?
Well, I started out the way I would hope most users would start out, which is when I had a problem, I would file a bug report. I would encounter various bugs in daily usage, so I would file bugs, and I would correspond with developers over this. And as I think I mentioned before, I had really good experiences overall corresponding with KDE developers. Not universally, but on balance, it was just very pleasant. I felt listened to as a user. And sometimes the bugs that I filed were like very tiny minor issues, and they would encourage me to fix the issue myself, which at the time was like way beyond what I could do. I didn't know anything. Didn't have like a development environment set up or anything, but they encouraged me to try, and I started submitting small patches to fix the little issues that I found. And I just found that to be so empowering, because going from like having an issue to fixing your own issue, there's something magical about that. And I just kind of got hooked, really. As I did it more, I gained technical skills. I got the ability to fix more bugs and bigger bugs, and that helped me to get to the point where pardon me, that helped me to get to the point where a few months later, when KDE was working on their goal setting process, they solicited prospective goals from community members to say, what should we focus on for the next few years? And I submitted a goal, as presumptuous as that would be, a very new user. I submitted this usability and productivity goal. I said we should focus on basic usability and like productivity use cases. And much to my shock and surprise, it was selected as one of the 3 goals. So now here I am, like a new Plasma user, and I'm like, okay, now what do I do? They selected my goal. Like, do they want me to do anything? And of course, what I found was that they was not really they was we, because they considered me a member at that point. I was a we. And so I would ask, what should I do about this? And people said, I don't know, start doing it, right? Start helping people to organize it. And I said, well, I'm not the greatest developer at this point in my career, but I am a little bit better at communication and organizing. So that's when I decided to start this blog of mine, where I highlighted the different things that other people were working on every week. And I figured this would be a good way to generate excitement about the initiative. This would be a good way to let people know that something was actually happening. And maybe through promoting it, I could attract more people. We would see that it's not this moribund thing that's dead. They would think that there's excitement there. And where there's excitement, people want to be there, right?
Yep. Well, I want to thank you for starting that blog, because that just in itself is a perfect example of what we need more of, which is bridging that gap between developers and the community, where we need both sides to come together a little bit. We need the community to come together to, give more feedback, to help submit more bugs, but we also need the developers to be a little bit more understanding of what it's like to be a user, maybe even a new user.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I see that as one of my primary roles, which is to help bring people together. But at the same time, the open source community is very much a self-service community. And so while I do my best to bridge that gap, I always encourage people to get out of their shells too. So, for developers, that means learn to communicate with users a little bit better, especially if you find that you're having abrasive interactions with people on a regular basis. Maybe that's on you. Maybe you need to, work on your communication skills a little bit. Similarly, if you're a user, work on your technical skills a little bit, be patient with developers because they spend all their time looking at code, often not people. So give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Learn what kind of information developers need. So that gap is bridgeable by an intermediary person, but the gap itself doesn't also need to be as big if we all try to meet each other halfway, and speak the same language. This is why I'm always encouraging our visual designers to be more technical. And I'm always encouraging our technical developers to be more visual, because everything gets easier if we kind of understand each other a little bit, if we have those shared languages, because then everything just becomes simpler to communicate with one another.
Yep. Well, I think the other thing that your blog highlights is the fact of how much work is actually being done behind the scenes.
Oh my gosh.
Because time goes by and, you don't, oh, well, KDE has a new release. Well, your blog highlights all of the, well, not all of, some of the steps that goes into all of them little fixes to be a release.
In fact, that's true. What I highlight on my blog is, I don't know, maybe even 25% of what actually goes on throughout all of KDE, because there's just so much. And I mostly try to keep my blog a very user-focused thing. So I blog about features and I blog about user interface improvements and bug fixes, but I notably don't blog about code refactoring, which is incredibly important. I don't blog about new APIs being added to frameworks, which is also incredibly important. I only blog about the last mile of those efforts. So here's an example. A couple of my colleagues right now are working on making apps run in their own C groups, which I won't attempt to explain because it's actually even a little bit above my head, but it's super cool and awesome, and it will make all sorts of things better. I haven't blogged at all about this yet because it's all back-end work. Eventually, once the final product is merged, I'll write a blog post that has one entry in it that's KDE, all apps are now run in their own C groups, which allows us to do things like prioritize the frontmost app and deprioritize all other apps behind it. That would be the user-facing version of that feature. But by only blogging about that, I'm kind of hiding the fact that this has been in development for a year and has hundreds and hundreds of hours of developer time on it. So, I can't do everything, and I really try to keep it with this very user-facing focus, but it's just amazing how much is going on behind the scenes all the time in KDE.
Well, we need more of that. I think we need more people like yourself stepping up and doing that kind of thing. Well, your blog, it just doesn't talk about just KDE. So you had a few posts in it a little while ago about a new laptop that you got.
Yes.
And you were very open about some of the things that worked and some of the things that didn't work. And I respect that. I love that, because I think we need to give people the real situation. You don't want to, candy coat everything and say, oh, everything in Linux works great.
Nope.
So tell us about your new laptop and some of the things that worked and some of the things that didn't.
Yeah. I want to get back to something you just said, because that's a principle I very strongly agree with, that we shouldn't candy coat things. I think it does nobody any favors to pretend that something is good when it's not. The way I see it is that when we do this, we actually impede our own ability to improve it, which, I don't know, that's silly. Aren't we here to improve stuff, right? So like,
let's hope so.
So like my laptop has problems. I want to fix those problems. And the way we fix those problems is by acknowledging that they exist. Yeah, so as for the laptop itself, it's a Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Yoga. The hardware is incredible, and I love the hardware. It's got like the best keyboard I've ever used, best trackpad I've used outside of a Mac, beautiful screen, great speakers. Unfortunately, a lot of these things were very difficult to get working in software, which is where my problems arose. And, this was sort of a challenge, because like a lot of the stuff was not at the user-facing layer. Some of it went deeper into the stack. And then it becomes a challenge to find out exactly where it is. So like I'd read all these reviews that this laptop had great speakers. And I played music, and this music sounded terrible. So I figured there's probably some kind of audio issue going on. So where is that audio issue? Is it in KDE software, in our like UI for controlling the volume? Is it in Pulse Audio? Is it in ALSA? Is it in Jack? Is it in Pipewire? Is it in the kernel? Who knows? It could be anywhere. Maybe it's in all those places, right? So like, this was a really challenging thing for me, was tracking down where in the stack all of these problems came from. And I'm happy to report that most of them are now solved. And I'll note, not only solved for me, but solved for everybody else too, because fixes have gone into the kernel, or they've gone into Pulse Audio, or they've gone into Plasma in the case of part of the audio issue, which I managed to fix, where my laptop's audio devices showed up as 6 devices instead of 2.
Yep.
4 outputs and 2 inputs, I believe. And I would look at this thing and I'd be like, oh my gosh, what did we even do with this? But that spurred me to investigate Pulse Audio stuff a little bit, and I worked on our applet, and I managed to improve the presentation for that. But it was like rage-driven development, because I would look at this thing and I would just like get so angry at the system for presenting the audio devices in such a stupid way. I would be like, I have to fix this immediately. This is like priority number 1.
But I think that's awesome, because that is how most problems get solved.
Yep.
You have a need, or you have a problem, and somebody with either the technical ability or the willingness to learn the technical things needed to go and fix that problem. So I'm sure there's a lot of people thanking you right now.
And I would encourage other people to do the same thing. I didn't know anything about all of this stuff before I started investigating it, but it's all pretty logical. You can figure it out. So if you've got a similar problem with your own computer, with some hardware, with some software, just dive in. The code's all there. The people are friendly. That's how everything gets fixed.
Yep. Well, one of your recent posts talked about migrating to GitLab.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about why KDE made that switch and the benefits that come from that?
Yeah. So there were a few reasons for this. First, let me introduce Fabricator, which was the system we had before GitLab. That's what we migrated away from. Now, I personally really liked Fabricator. I thought it worked well for my needs, but a lot of other people did not feel that it worked well for their needs, and in particular, drive-by contributors who wanted to submit patches. Over the last decade or so, I think GitHub has really popularized this fork the repo and submit a pull request style. So lots of people are very familiar with this. And Fabricator notably did not use that workflow. Fabricator used a patch-based workflow, and it required the use of some esoteric tools to get it to work properly. And we just got so many complaints from people that they did not like this system. And we wrote lots of documentation detailing how to do it, and we tried to make it better, but people just still didn't like it. So we decided that it was going to be time for a change. Oh, I'm forgetting. Another reason was our relationship with the Fabricator developers had kind of fallen off a little bit. we noticed that Fabricator itself was not getting as much development activity. When we would file bugs, they would just kind of get ignored. So we felt like we didn't have the kind of channel to the developers that we needed to allow the system to grow with us. Whereas for GitLab, that's definitely not true. The GitLab people, I would say, wooed us a little bit. They promised us that we would have their attention, and ever since switching to them, we have. So when we have a bug, a problem with GitLab, we tell them about it, and a lot of times they go and fix it, or at least they look at the bug and read it and discuss it internally and prioritize it. And so we feel like we have a relationship with the GitLab people. We feel like, I think, it's a service that can grow with us rather than something that's kind of frozen in time that we have to live with forever, which was how people were coming to see Fabricator. And the world changes. You can't stay doing the same thing forever. And so I think ultimately GitLab has been a really positive thing because it makes it easier for people to submit code. It gives us the opportunity in the future also to switch to GitLab issues and away from Bugzilla, which is something that Fabricator didn't give us. Fabricator did not have a well-developed bug tracking system, but GitLab does. Now, this is kind of controversial in the KDE community right now. Most people, I think, are in favor of this, but there are some people who really, really, really like Bugzilla a lot. And so we're going to have to convince them, otherwise. But I'm myself fairly convinced that it's going to happen anyway, because the benefits of moving to GitLab issues are pretty tremendous, in my opinion. And that's something that we get with GitLab too.
Well, can you talk a little bit about what we can do on a whole to help the whole process of fixing bugs and that the communication between developers and community?
Are you talking about in like a sort of cross-distro, cross-environment way?
Right. Is there a possibility that there could be a program that could be cross-distro that could be created to make it easier for bugs to be created?
Yeah, so in fact, we in KDE already have that program. It's called Dr. Conky. It's like a little desktop bug reporting tool. I think right now it's pretty much hardwired into our Bugzilla instance, but in principle, I suppose you could modify it to be able to point it at any other Bugzilla instance. And eventually, once we move to GitLab, we'll have to change it so that it knows how to file GitLab issues. And once we do that, you would be able to probably point it at your GitLab instance. So the GNOME people could use it. They use GitLab. The free desktop people could use it. In principle, anybody else who uses GitLab could probably do this if we were to do that. And now that you mention it, that's sort of a cool idea, because we in KDE really try to encourage people to use our apps without feeling like they have to use Plasma itself. That's an important thing because we work hard to make our apps like cross-functional and cross-platform. We don't want it to only work in our environment. So if we could like help the whole community by making this bug reporting app that works all over the place, that's pretty cool. I like that idea. We should do that.
That would be fantastic.
Let me write that down.
So KDE's always innovating and working on new things just like this. What would you say the strengths of KDE Plasma are, and maybe some areas for improvement for the whole project?
Yeah. So if you want to talk about the whole project, that would pretty much be KDE itself as a community. Why don't I do that and then talk about Plasma?
Okay.
So, I think when you want to talk about KDE, our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness, which is that we are a very decentralized, anarchic community. In a lot of ways, I'm kind of amazed that it works at all, honestly, because like we don't really have like a management layer. We don't have a benevolent dictator for life. We don't have a giant corporate sponsor that like prioritizes activities and like hires everybody. It's mostly just a ton of volunteers doing this stuff on their spare time, on nights and weekends, probably at their day jobs when they should be working at their day jobs. Guilty as charged. I totally did that. I assume everybody does based on the hours that people are contributing, but open secret, right?
Right.
So like this anarchic nature is something that means that probably KDE can never be destroyed, right? Like we're not dependent on one revenue stream or like one corporate backer or like one charismatic person at the top who calls all the shots. It means that it's a very resilient community. It's not just going to like get taken over or die or something. But on the other hand, it's really hard to coordinate everything. It's like, and I say this as a person with the job title of QA manager, like it is so hard to get people all on the same page. It's really difficult to coordinate stuff. And that's something that is just like a sort of ongoing challenge. And, I have to say that it makes you sort of up your game, your management game too, because when you're working in a commercial company, you have various tools to motivate people. You've got money, there's like cash rewards, there's employee of the month, there's all kinds of stuff, but then like that's the carrot. But you've also got the stick, which is I'm your boss, you'll do it because I said so, and ultimately if you don't, I'm going to fire you. And like those are all tools that we don't have in KDE. We have to motivate people entirely using positivity and excitement, not fear, not money, not threats, and so that's the challenge, really, is like figuring out how to unite all of these volunteers who are all over the world and get them all to generally work on consistent stuff. You have to generate excitement and like show them that stuff is cool, make them want to work on it because it's just so awesome that who wouldn't want to work on it, right?
Yep.
Like that's the goal. And it's a real challenge. It really is, honestly. I mean, maintaining that level of excitement personally is sometimes a challenge. It's something I have to work at. You gotta stay excited because excitement is infectious and people want to follow you and do what you want to do if you're excited about something. I feel like if I ever become a manager at some commercial company, it's a lesson that I'll take with me because it's a way better method of motivating people than being like, do it or you're fired.
Yeah. Well, we have said many times, just in our community talking, that it doesn't matter if you have a passion for something. I enjoy listening to you because of that. I might not even know what you're talking about. Might not even care what you're talking about, but because you're excited about it or because you have a passion about it,
exactly,
that makes you want to listen to that.
That's right.
So
because passion is infectious. It just is, no matter what. Anyway, so I think the next part of your question was about KDE Plasma itself, our flagship product. I'm actually going to give a similar answer, which is Plasma's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, which is its adaptability and customizability and configurability. I think I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why I really liked Plasma was because it adapted so seamlessly to my needs and my workflow. But that very adaptability is something that we constantly get feedback from users saying that it's like overwhelming. It's too hard to figure out how to configure stuff. There's just like too much stuff there. When something breaks, they don't know how to fix it. They don't know where to find settings and like so on and so forth. So this is a really common thing that we hear, and we work really hard on trying to improve it. But it's tough. It's like a tough conceptual thing because the easiest way to fix this problem is to have fewer features, right? You have fewer features, you have a niche, and you hit that niche as hard as you possibly can. You polish your one marble until it is incredibly shiny, but you still only have one marble, right? That's just like not our way in KDE. If you were to go up to somebody, like say somebody's complaining about Plasma, right? They're saying, "Oh my God, it's overwhelming. I can't deal with it. How do I configure it? Everything is in too many places. Why don't you just simplify it?" If you were to ask this person, would you like it if we got rid of half the features so that it was easier to use? They would say, of course not. I want all those features. So like that's the challenge, right? Is like we need to come up with a good user interface for presenting this power in a way that preserves the power. We can't get rid of it. Because if we just get rid of features until our stuff is really polished, then we're actually just like GNOME. We're just like elementary OS. We're just like Mac OS. Those already exist. Like they're going to be better at being them than we could be if we tried to be them. We have to be us. And what makes us us is that focus on people on like the right side of the technology adoption lifecycle curve. Like we focus on early adopters, technical experts, power users. Yes, we work a lot to make things better for regular users, but like our core is probably always going to be the power users, and we can't throw that away. We just can't. It would destroy what makes us us.
Well, you mentioned about people trying it and feeling overwhelmed. A lot of the people that I talk to who maybe are not KDE users, but they try KDE, that's the number one complaint, is that everything is overwhelming.
We hear this all the time. It's like, I agree with you. It's the most common complaint. People are like, wow, I love it. It's powerful. I can't figure out how to use it.
So is there a way in the settings to make a change where there's maybe a simple settings and maybe an advanced settings?
That's a really interesting question. We get that exact question a lot. It seems to be the most obvious solution, which is like, why don't you just make a simple mode and like an advanced mode? And you put some settings in the simple mode and some settings in the advanced mode. And the truth is, we don't want to do this because we don't think that it actually works. There are a couple reasons why. One is emotional, because let's say you're a user and you use a piece of software and it has like a toggle, simple mode or advanced mode. Now, in order to figure out which mode is right for you, you have to make a judgment about yourself. If you choose simple mode, you're basically insulting yourself. You're saying, I'm too dumb to use the advanced features. If you choose the advanced mode, you're saying, I'm smart and technically competent. Like, these are implicitly the judgments there. But what if you're actually not technically competent enough to use the advanced features? Then you use them anyway and you blow yourself up. So like,
Done that.
Exactly. See, that's my point, is like, I don't think it actually works for that reason. Then there's also the problem of like, simple and advanced are two discrete modes, but this hides a lot of nuance and nebulosity, because what about intermediate level features? Where does an intermediate feature live, right? You got to choose which one to put it in. And if you put it in the basic one, maybe it's overwhelming. If you put it in the advanced one, maybe people who could use it, who are using the basic settings, will never find it. And so I think it's really difficult to make those kinds of categorizations. And personally, I don't find those kinds of very hard and fast categories helpful. I think what matters more is for us to rearrange the presentation of the settings so that we're putting things in front of users where they want to use it, rather than hiding things deep in like super deep levels of nesting. We want to make sure that roughly where a person is looking for something is where they will find it. We want to make sure that when they do need extra settings, it's accessible from the same place, not in an explicit basic advanced way, but in a sort of, I don't know, like a progressive disclosure model. The way this works is like, you only see what you need to see at a particular moment in time, but you can always see more later. Not explicitly by switching between modes, but like, for example, having subpages. So we have this new paradigm that we're using in a lot of system settings where we have like multiple subpages that you can go in. And you can always not go there. And there's never any feature on a subpage that you actually can't get on another page. Rather, the subpage shows you a refinement of the basic feature. So like in our notifications page, for example, we have some basic settings for notifications for how you do stuff. Then we have a subpage that allows you to configure things on a per application basis. This is like the super nerdy page. Most people are never going to need to look at it, but it's not an explicit advanced thing. It's like a level of refinement of a setting that's already there. So that's sort of something that we're working on that we think we're going to try to hit harder in the future. And hopefully that and other things that we're working on will improve this. But let me tell you, I hear you. I hear users. I hear about this all the time. So we are entirely aware that this is like a common complaint.
Well, I think you're in a no-win situation because all of us are individuals and all of us are different and would probably put some setting in this section where another person would think it would be somewhere else. So you would always have that back and forth. So
that's exactly why it's hard and why we can't do like an explicit, advanced, simple thing. But even if we're not doing that, like this reminds me of another thing that happened about a year ago. So there's this infamous single double click setting in KDE, right? So you can open files or folders by single clicking on them or by double clicking on them, which is what most other operating systems do. So the setting to control this used to live in the mouse settings, right? Duh, you're using a mouse, you click on the mouse, it's how many times you have to click. When we redid the mouse settings to support libinput, we took a long look at this and we said, this isn't really a mouse setting. This is like an input setting, but it's not a mouse setting, and we didn't have a general input page, so we put it on our general behavior page in system settings. Suddenly we instantly get bug reports of people saying, I can't find the single click setting anymore. Where is it? Why did you morons move it out of the mouse settings? And so I would have this like canned response almost where I would put in the bug reports. I'd say, well, we moved it out of the mouse settings because it's actually not a mouse setting. You see, people with touchpads don't know to look for it in the mouse setting and so on and so forth. But it's like, no matter what you do, even when you move something into an ostensibly better place, it's like people will say, you broke my workflow. I was used to it being over there, even if there is wrong, right?
Yep. So what about you personally? Single click or double click?
So I actually mostly in the past used double click, but I will admit, I just switched to single click 3 months ago to try it out, and I actually love it. I think it's way better. I started using this, and I was like, what in the earth is this? You click once, how do I select files? And then like I couldn't get used to it. I turned it off. I evangelized against it. And then I tried it and I actually really liked it.
I love it because we have had this conversation so many times in the community, and I take a lot of heat for being a single click user. I've been a single click user for ever since even Windows days, where I would go in and change that setting.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, so I created the hashtag Save the Mice.
Save the mice.
So we can have less clicks on our mice.
Clicking on it as much, right? Save your mice. Your touchpads too. Maybe that's why I had to get a new laptop, in fact. Because one of the reasons with my old laptop was the touchpad stopped working. I would click on it once and it would do a double click.
Yep. And as far as selecting, I don't select that often. So what I do is I hold control and select what I need. But that happens very rarely. So
yeah. I mean, personally, I got in the habit of selecting all the time, especially for like deleting. This was just like my Mac habit. What I would do when I wanted to delete a file is I would like select it and then press the keyboard shortcut for delete rather than like dragging it to the trash or using the context menu. And I still have that habit. So I still do that right now because I just find it faster to do that, especially on Plasma where the shortcut is just the delete key and it's the top right key in the keyboard. So I can like hit it without even thinking about it.
Yep. Well, I'm going to be 100% honest with you here. I started using KDE back in 3.5 days. I came over from Windows because of wanting to customize Windows and not being able to. Mm-hmm. So when I found Linux and I found you could customize just about everything in KDE, I was ecstatic and overjoyed. I loved it. And
yeah,
that was great. There was also, quite a few bugs back then and things that maybe I didn't know how to fix. So there would be little, video glitches, or maybe you'd open a window and it would go on the wrong screen, or there were just a lot of nitpicky little issues with it. So it made me kind of go in the direction of trying out new distros.
Yeah.
So, because there was a lot of paper cuts involved. So over the years, I have now, distro hopped 1,400,000,000 and whatever times. So it's been a lot. And back in April of 2019, I ended up on Pop! OS, and that has been my main distro since then.
Cool.
So I have this love-hate relationship with KDE.
Mm-hmm.
I love it for the awesome features that it has, for the power of the settings that it gives you. The things that you can do, like maybe I want this window to open in this particular spot all the time here. And that allows you to do that. Now, it doesn't always 100% work all the time, but it does allow you to do it.
So if I can just interrupt real fast, you'll be happy to hear that I am right now implementing a feature to have all KDE apps automatically remember the position of their main windows without you having to do anything.
I love it.
First patch landed today. The next one will hopefully land soon. It's
awesome.
Happening. Anyway, well, I interrupted you.
That's okay. But I loved it. And I also hated it for all those little tiny annoyances. And the reason that I bring all of that up is to bring up the fact that you wrote a blog post and it was titled, "Why don't you just fix this thing already?" Mm-hmm. So can you tell us about that blog post and the options people like myself have?
So this blog post was something that evolved from a Reddit comment that I made to somebody who was complaining with that terminology, right? Why don't you just fix this thing? It's been broken for 15 years. It's terrible. I hate it. What's wrong with you? Don't you notice it? And some people actually talk like that or write like that on the internet.
I've
Write like that
said
on the internet.
I've never written like that on the internet, but I have said that to myself.
I know. Sometimes I feel that way too. But anyway, so I think the open source community in general is a very counterintuitive community for people who are used to closed source software that you buy or steal, as many people do. With closed source software, the expectation is that it is very polished and of high quality. And if you're having a problem, you either get support from a vendor or you just use an alternative. You don't use it. You don't even think to try to improve it. Whereas the open source community is very different because improve it yourself is like the very first thing there. And if you can't do that, you're encouraged to contact the developer, ask them, tell them to do it. It's a much more hands-on process. And this is sort of necessary because of the manpower involved here. Like in a commercial software company, you got people who are paid to work on this stuff full time, right? Like that's their job. Open source software is mostly made by volunteers. And so if you're having a problem with it, it's likely that the people who are in a position to fix it are just that, volunteers. So like there's inherently a self-service aspect to using open source where because you haven't paid money to buy it, presumably, some people do, but if you haven't paid money to buy it, you still have to pay somehow, right? Like nothing in this world is actually free. We talk about free open source and, free isn't beer, right? Like I didn't buy it, but like freedom isn't free, right? Like you have to, when you're talking about political freedom, you have to defend freedom. When it comes to software, it's exactly the same thing, where if you've gotten this software for free from somebody else's effort, somebody else's labor of love, you're kind of expected to put in at least a little bit yourself if you're having a problem, And what that little bit looks like could be something as simple as don't have an entitled attitude, right? Like if you're thinking, this sucks, I hate it, what's wrong with you? Why isn't this better? Well, okay, that's your attitude. Maybe you're feeling that. Sometimes I feel it too, but like this was made by people. It wasn't made by some big faceless corporation somewhere. It was made by somebody like you. Maybe somebody with a job who does it on nights and weekends. Maybe somebody with children who's doing this instead of playing with their children, right? Maybe this is a labor of love for somebody. So like, you got to be respectful there. You got to be respectful of other people's work and the time that they've put in and, to help out a little bit yourself.
Yep. I think that is the biggest downside to the Linux ecosystem is that the efforts and the work that go into the software itself don't always get acknowledged by the people that are using it.
Yeah. And it's hard. I think people just haven't been trained in this because you're used to all of your products that you use on a daily basis, right? Like you buy something on Amazon, where does it come from? I don't know, some anonymous factory in China, right? You go into a store and you buy something. Who sold it to you? Some big bloated faceless corporation. But like open source is different. There isn't an anonymous factory and a big bloated corporation and like armies of child slave laborers somewhere. It's like it's made by people like you who have chosen to do this. And so I think it requires a paradigm shift as a user. You're not just getting an app for free and like, good for you, you beat the system. You're buying into a community that asks for you to pay, not with money, but with time and respect, really.
Yep. Well, if you were to try to convince me right now, not that you are, but if you were to try to convince me right now to switch to Plasma today, what would you point to help sway me over?
What I would first do is turn it around and become the interviewer for a second. Because you said that you use Pop! OS. Mm-hmm. I hear a lot about Pop! OS. I haven't actually used it myself, but I've been meaning to try it out. So I would like to know, what is it that made you settle on Pop! OS as your primary distro? Why is it better than everything else for you? Why is it better than Plasma, which you say you have a love-hate relationship with? Why is it better than GNOME, which it's based on? What makes it better for you?
Well, I think there's two levels to that. One is the GNOME thing, where there are other GNOME distributions. So why would I choose Pop! OS over another GNOME distribution? And I think that part of that is the level of effort that goes into the user-facing things that you see in Pop! OS, including the theme, including the dark mode that goes throughout, including the applets that they select for installing as default. There's a lot of thought process going into that by Pop! OS, by System 76.
Yeah.
The overall answer to that is there isn't one thing that says this is the outstanding feature of why you should try Pop! OS. It's the overall mindset of System 76 and what they're trying to accomplish that draws me to that.
Yeah.
So they are, implementing things like they have a separate ISO for NVIDIA versus AMD. These little things that go into it all add up to showing you how much they care about the community, how much they care about Pop! OS. And I think that's what I'm buying into more so than any feature that I could point out to you.
So the reason why I wanted to ask was because that was, of course, going to inform my answer. And I would have to say my answer is I wouldn't try to convince you to use KDE Plasma, because it sounds like what you like most about Pop! OS is the philosophy and the culture that you've bought into. I mean, I hear what you're saying about like the overall product works well, right? Like it's polished, it doesn't have, bugs. They have good attention to detail, and like we can do that too. But even if we did that, we wouldn't be System 76. We wouldn't have their mindset and their philosophy. So if you found what works for you in terms of mindset and philosophy, grab it tight and never let go. That's what I would say. I think it's so rare and special to find something like that. I feel a little bit anthropomorphic about computers here, but it's like when you find a computer that suits you personally, like it works ergonomically for you physically, you like the software, it meshes with your values, it respects the things that you think are important, like there's nothing more important than that. Keep using it. It sounds like you've got exactly what you need and you should stay with it. Now, if Pop! OS ever offers a KDE Plasma session, of course, I'll feel differently.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I think it's so important for people to live their values and to be aligned with their values, both for like an ideological moral standpoint, but also a practical one, which is, let's say, for example, you're a person who likes change. You find change exciting, right? Well, in that case, probably Debian is a bad distro for you, because Debian ships ancient software and has new major versions every 2 years, right? Ubuntu LTS would be a bad choice for you. Not that these are bad distros, but it would be a bad choice for you, because the characteristics of what make those distros themselves just wouldn't match your values. Instead, you should probably use a rolling release distro like Arch or OpenSUSE Tumbleweed or something like that. Again, not because they're better, but because they match your values, they match your mindset, they match your attitude, and that's the way I feel pretty much about Plasma in terms of the software, is like Plasma matches my values and attitude by respecting me and letting me use the computer how I want and adjusting to me. And like, that's why I use it. That's why I started using it, despite the fact that it was really buggy and had ugly things in it. Like, it worked for me in that respect. Yep. And so that was what was most important. And I think it's really important, like, for everybody to become aligned with their values and everything that they do. Ultimately, it's such a relief in life to do this, to not feel like you're becoming like physically or morally compromised by your choices.
Well, I still love Plasma even to this day, regardless that I use Pop! OS.
Well, keep checking it out. See if the magic ever sparkles again for you, because we're constantly making it better. We really are.
All right. So what can you talk about with 520?
So 520 is going to be a pretty cool, exciting release. We've got a lot of user visible stuff in the task manager and in the system tray in particular. One thing with the system tray is that we moved to a grid of icons, and we have revamped how you are able to configure icons. You can choose the size of the icons to match your panel if you want. Speaking of panels, we have now officially moved in Plasma 520 to an icons-only task manager, which now matches pretty much what everybody else does. We've moved away from the Windows Vista style task manager. Icons only all the way with a thicker panel, so it's like we've moved into the 21st century, finally. As for the task manager itself, we have a very fancy, awesome new feature that I just got done doing like a few days ago that will allow you to cycle through tasks through windows of a grouped task. So if you open like 3 Firefox windows, in 519 and earlier, when you click on the Firefox icon on your task manager, it shows you like a little list of the windows, or it shows you the present windows effect and asks you to choose. In 520, it will actually cycle through each of the windows individually. And not only
Nice.
that, it will take you to the last window that you used. So you can always go back and forth very quickly between things like that. There's a bunch of other stuff, but those are some of the highlights from my perspective. We were hoping to ship the new visual style for apps in 520. So far, it's looking like that's probably not going to happen. We'll shoot for 521. It's just so complicated and there's so many moving parts. We have to make sure we get it right, and it's just not ready yet.
So when does 520 ship?
2 months, I think. We have a release cycle where we do 3 Plasma releases per year. And each one of them is interspersed 4 months apart. So I think the next one is coming out in about 2 months, 2.5 months, something like that. It's a really fast release cycle. So, for people who like seeing stuff improve quickly, it's a good situation because you get new stuff really quickly.
Right. Love it. All right, so let's get into the community and some open source stuff. So have you attended any Linux conferences?
I have only ever attended KDE's Academy once. That was 2 years ago, before COVID. That's it. I haven't done any other open source conferences or anything like that.
Well, what is the feel of that type of conference? Is it just all like diving into code, or what are we talking about?
It's hard for me to give an average answer because, again, I've literally only been to one. So I have a sample size of 1 here. But based on that one conference that I did go to, there are lots of talks where people give presentations about things. Then there are sort of in-depth coding sessions. There are what are called birds of a feather sessions where people get together to work on stuff that is difficult to discuss remotely, and it's easier to do in person. It's just such a great attitude to be able to talk with people in person, because internet communication is like way better than no communication, but it can't hold a candle to in-person communication. So what I've found is that whenever I manage to see my colleagues in person, so much stuff happens so fast because you can actually have face-to-face discussions and like resolve long-standing issues and things like that.
Well, I've only been to one conference, but it sounds like that conference is a nice place to be because it's around people that, have the same thought process, the same values.
That too. It's funny because like at these conferences, you'll meet people from all over the world, all different countries, but like everybody's basically a Linux nerd. So they have 99% of things in common, despite what country they come from and what language they speak. I mean, this is what I find, right? Like I find that I have much more in common with the average KDE contributor than I do with like most Americans who I meet, walking around on a daily basis.
Right. Well, are you an open source enthusiast where everything you run has to be free and open source? Or are you on the pragmatic side where you use whatever tool is the best tool for the job, even if it may include proprietary software?
I kind of go back and forth on this. I see both sides. On one hand, the practical perspective has a lot going for it because, sometimes you just have to get something done, right? But on the other hand, the ideological perspective has an advantage that I feel like some people often overlook. Sometimes it feels like, oh, you should only use free open source software as a matter of principle. Well, I have a story about it not being a matter of principle, about it being a matter of practicality. When I decided to move away from Mac OS to Linux, I discovered just how much of my data was in these opaque binary formats that were opened and saved by proprietary apps. And some of these apps have export features. Some of them don't. Sometimes you were unlucky enough to be using a proprietary file format for an app that's no longer available. What happens to your data? It's gone forever. And this is like awful and terrifying and scary when it happens, because like that's been my experience, is that proprietary software often works better than open source software in the short term, but you can't rely on it. Because if you put your data, your life, your heart and soul into a proprietary app, you're tying yourself to that app, to the company that makes it, to the developer, to the political whims of what's going on inside that company. If they cancel the app and, you know, your data could just be stuck in it, right? What if the app decides, what if the company goes out of business? And for example, the computer that you're running it on makes a major change to what CPU they use. They move, for example, from PowerPC to Intel. Now you can't run any of your old PowerPC software except for a translation layer. Maybe the translation layer gets deleted in the future. Now you can't run any of your old PPC software. What if the only app in existence that opens that old file that you have is a PPC app? You're screwed. You've lost your data. You can't get it out forever. And I had this when I moved from macOS. I discovered that this art program that I used, it was called Bryce 3D. It was a 3D modeling program, and it saved the images that it created in the pict format, .pict, which was always fine for many years until I decided to move to Linux. At which point I discovered this was an old obsolete file format that nobody had ever heard of anymore, and nothing supported it. And all the art that I had ever made as a child was inaccessible. It was gone. I couldn't get at it anymore. And so what I eventually ended up having to do is I opened up all of these files one by one on my Mac, opened them full screen in a preview window, and took a full screen screenshot, and then saved that as a PNG. That's what I had to do to get my data out of this old file format, because I was using proprietary software. The same thing happened for my photos that were in iPhoto. I had to delve into the database schema to find out exactly how to get all of the stuff out of it. And it's like, these apps were great to use at the time. I loved using them, but ultimately they left me high and dry because I was completely dependent on them. And I couldn't take them with me when I went somewhere else. And one of them just died entirely. Bryce is dead. It's not developed anymore. And like, you know, I think using proprietary software in the short term can be an acceptable transition. I use Discord and Telegram. You know, these have proprietary server backends, even though the user interface is open source. But ultimately, I find that open source is the only software you can actually rely on in the long term. It's the only program software that's not going to let you down in the end when you most need it. And so on that note, I have to basically be on the side of open source software all the way, even though I'm willing to compromise that at various times just in the interest of practicality. But that always has to be a temporary thing, not a permanent thing, because you can't permanently rely on closed source software. You just can't.
Well, I think that that's a scary thing, to have your data and not be able to get to it.
It was awful. And you know, there were other examples too. I made home movies with my friends. We would make these like silly movies where we would hit each other with sticks, and then I would put like lightsaber effects on the sticks to make it look like we were hitting each other with lightsabers. And all of these were made in an old proprietary effects software called AlamDV. And it was just like briefly there and then died. And so like I couldn't get at the actual project files anymore. All I had was the file formats that it exported, which were in this .mov file format with like some obscure codec that apparently QuickTime could read, but nothing else could read it. So when I moved to Linux, suddenly it's all inaccessible. It's just gone. To this day, I have not figured out how to access those things. It's just gone. And like, you know, so that became a bit of a rallying cry for me, where even if the open source software is clunkier to use, even if it's not as nice, if I have to use a piece of proprietary software and risk everything that I've created with it being lost in the future, I don't want to do that.
Yep.
You know, I'll only use proprietary software for something that's like a short-term project. Like if I know that I'm going to be able to export the data into an open file format, or it's only going to be a temporary thing, then yeah, okay. I mean, I'll use it. But like, I've been using computers for 25 years now, and with that kind of a time frame, I don't want to lose the work that I've got now in the next 25 years. I want to be
Right.
able to access that stuff forever. And so for me, that means open source software all the way, really.
Well, I started using Linux, like I had said earlier, because I could customize it. And, it was flexible enough to allow me to do what I wanted. Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that the community itself is the best reason to run Linux.
Yeah.
What drives your passion for Linux?
That is a great question. What drives my passion is the idea that a user-friendly desktop operating system should not perish from this earth. And I believe that we are at risk of that happening, very significant risk. Windows 10 is essentially spyware. You can't trust it. You categorically cannot trust it. macOS, which I long believed to be the paragon of user interface and user experience for regular, ordinary people, has been neglected by Apple for years and is systematically transforming into iOS. This is obviously what they're doing. And iOS is an operating system that is suitable for regular people, but unsuitable for technical experts, for creators, for power users. It's just not for them, really. It's like a content consumption OS. And I say this as a former Apple person who actually worked on iOS. It's hard for me to say. And I like iOS. I think it's really good, but iOS is a niche and it's not targeted at, frankly, people like you and me. And so I see that there's a risk of the two major proprietary operating systems both becoming widely unsuitable for people like us to use. And this thought fills me with cosmic dread. I do not want this to happen. And I feel like the only way to preserve a semblance of usability and power for people like us is for that to be embodied in an open source operating system. Because as I said before, you can't rely on proprietary OSs. Proprietary software, they may go away, they may change, they may morph into something you don't like, they may become, a subscription model like Adobe software is, where you have to pay or else you're locked out of everything. They may turn into spyware like Windows now is. I mean, you can't rely on this stuff. And so it's up to us as Linux people. We now, as Linux people, are the guardians of the desktop user experience for all of humanity. I really do truly believe that. And that was the reason why I wanted to find a very user-friendly desktop environment and operating system when I started using Linux. It's why I started with GNOME, and it's why I want to really help to move KDE Plasma in the direction of having that crown. I want Plasma to be the most usable and powerful desktop environment in existence, so that a user-friendly computing environment will not perish from this earth. That is my overwhelming passion, and I will not stop until it is realized.
That is a tall task to ask.
I'll probably die before it happens, but if I have to be working on it for the next 60 years, I will.
But that's an awesome goal as well. So in the Linux community, it has had a bad reputation for being unfriendly. You had mentioned earlier about maybe not being unfriendly, but maybe not the answers that you were looking for when you reported bugs or talked with the developers. So what has your experience been on a whole from a community member standpoint with Linux on a whole?
In general, I find that Linux people are super friendly and nice. It's almost like a little clique. It's like a social club, right? We're all here for the same thing. And we're all voluntarily here. That's important. Nobody's been forced here. Nobody's just in it for the money. We're all here because we share something in common. So at a basic level, I find that Linux people are really friendly and really nice. I often find that technical maintainers of very, very, very technically difficult software can sometimes have a little bit of difficulty communicating with us normies. I've noticed this is like a pattern, right? Like the more technical the software, the more technical the maintainer of that software has to be. And like the inherently more challenges there are communicating with users. But I think that's the exception and not the rule. And I think for those cases, you can have intermediaries, you can have facilitators, you can have people who bridge the gap and help them to understand users and users to understand them. But overall, I find that the open source community is a pretty nice and friendly place, as long as you stay off, toxic Reddit comments and stuff. But heck, if you're on social media, if you think that social media is real life, you will think that every person is a horrible scumbag. So don't think that, because it's not reality, right?
Yep.
I think that when you get outside of that particular toxic bubble, that the open source community is really nice and really friendly, and I like it.
Well, I agree. I try not to spend a whole lot of time on social media because...
yeah, same here.
Yeah.
I don't have Facebook. I don't have Twitter. I am only on Reddit basically to do customer support, user support for KDE stuff. That's all I do. So,
yep.
And I feel like I kind of have to do that just because I like to keep up my channel between, myself and users. I like to keep my finger on the pulse of what our users are actually doing. But yeah, you get some pretty hairy comments there sometimes.
Yep. Same with the YouTube channels, though. You know, you get some crazy comments.
Don't do that either. I don't do any of that stuff. Social media in general is a toxic plague on humanity that must be destroyed. I'm just going to casually say that. But, outside of that, I think people are nice.
Right. Well, I usually ask people, if they do any kind of coding. But, you contributing to KDE Plasma, obviously you do some coding.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have a favorite project that you worked on, or a favorite piece of software that meant a lot to you?
Favorite piece of software that meant a lot to me? I would have to say I have really fond memories of contributing to Dolphin. I don't actually do that much Dolphin work now, but I started with Dolphin. Some of my very first patches were simple fixes to Dolphin things. Technically, my first one was actually a KRunner one. I think I added, what did I add support for? I added support for some kind of unit conversion thing at KRunner. I can't even remember now. But Dolphin, it will always have a warm, fuzzy place in my heart, because it's just it's got a good code base. It's user friendly. All of its users love it. So whenever you work on Dolphin, people are like, yay, new Dolphin features, new Dolphin fixes. I love it. It's great. Which kind of gets back to what you were saying about community, The projects that I like working on the most are the ones where I get the most feedback. I find it really dispiriting to submit a merge request and it gets ignored, or to contribute to a piece of software that nobody uses. But when I'm working on a piece of software that lots of people use, and I can get feedback from its users, that's one of the things that really helps to drive my excitement and passion, is when I can actually see how excited my work is making other people. Being excited is something that comes to me, but I also sort of need the excitement of others, right? It kind of has to be a feedback cycle. And so making other people happy makes me happy, basically.
Well, I have to ask you, because I did a lot of videos on KDE over the years, and I did a video on quite a few years ago about opening Dolphin as root. And
oh no.
I have to ask you this. I have to.
Yeah.
So
all right.
This video still gets views today. The last time I checked, the solution that I provided in this video doesn't work anymore, because it was removed from Dolphin. Yep. So can you talk about the fact that it was removed, and is there a solution?
All right. So I will give you the gory details. I typically avoid doing this, but I'm actually going to give you the full story and the gory details here. So what happened was that the former KWin maintainer pushed a patch to do this, if I recall, without anybody's review even, because he found a security vulnerability, in a potential security vulnerability involving X11 and Dolphin. It was not an exploited security vulnerability. Nobody had ever actually reported that it had ever happened, or that it was ever even theoretically possible outside of the lab. Nonetheless, that was the reason. Lots of users complained. This person insisted that fixing the security vulnerability was more important than allowing users to do this. Many long debates ensued. It became a complete nightmare that resulted in lots of bitterness and recriminations, and it sucked, and I hated it, and everybody hated it. The current status is that you can actually open Dolphin as the root user, not as sudo, but as the root user. You can't do sudo Dolphin, you have to be the root user. This was a compromise that I managed to eke out with this maintainer after many, many, many weeks of blood, sweat, toil, and tears. He finally agreed to allow me to go forward with this minimal patch to unbreak the use case of Kali Linux, which runs everything as the root user. Because previously, you would boot into Kali Linux ISO, and you wouldn't even be able to run your file manager or your text editor, because both of them would not run as root. It was a completely idiotic, ridiculous situation, and I hated it, and it boiled my blood for it to even happen. And I mean, honestly, if I felt like I could get away with it, I would allow Dolphin to be run as sudo tomorrow. I could push the patch in literally 30 seconds. I could do it right now. But I don't want to do that because I want to respect what the community wants. Not only the users, because obviously the users want this, but it's also important what the developer community wants. And the truth is, running Dolphin as root is potentially dangerous. Is it actually dangerous in practice? Probably not. It's like leaving your front door open in your house, or not open, but unlocked, right? Like if you leave your front door unlocked, are you going to get robbed? Probably not. If you live in a really bad neighborhood, maybe that increases the likelihood that leaving your front door unlocked will make you get robbed. But for most of us, probably not. And it's that situation. In general, I like to err on the side of trusting users rather than infantilizing them, which is why this whole disallow Dolphin as root is so infuriating to me, because we have lots of other apps that you can run as root. You can run anything else as root if you want to. It's totally fine. We don't prevent that, just Dolphin and Kate. The thing with Kate is that Kate also is not allowed to run as root, but it doesn't matter, because when you run Kate as your user, then when you save something in like a root location, you get prompted for your password, and it does it that way. It uses PolicyKit, so it works. Dolphin does not have PolicyKit support. The reason why Dolphin does not have PolicyKit support is because there's a long languishing patch by a Google Summer of Code student that never got finished. It's like 99% finished, but it is not 100% finished. And there is like nobody in KDE who like can figure out how to make this thing work, because it is so technically complex.
You know, you had made a blog post one time on your blog about this situation, and you talked about it and what could be done about it. But I think that's what needs to happen, is more communication to let people, because there's a lot of people that just don't know. They don't understand. They've never heard that story before, and they don't know what's going on. So they're just frustrated that they can't open it as root.
It's a sensitive topic that gets everybody really riled up when you talk about it, and that inherently raises the stakes. It makes it difficult to have a dispassionate conversation about it.
Yeah.
It gets crazy. It really does.
So I don't know the official first post of your blog, but the oldest that I could go back and find was September of 2019. Mm-hmm. So one of the final paragraphs in this post says, I'm going to quote it, you can also check out communitykde.org/get involved and find out other ways to help be a part of something that really matters. You don't have to already be a programmer. I wasn't when I got started. So this paragraph was on that post. Ever since that time, it's been like a staple paragraph on all your posts where, you know, some of the words change, but you encourage people to get involved. Can you talk about how important it is for people to take that first step into getting involved, and that they don't need to be a developer to do it?
It's the most important step, because when you submit your first patch, even if it's not code, right? Even if it's like a documentation fix, you know, or something like that. When you submit your first patch, that means you have a development environment set up. It means you know how to use Git. It means you can check out a repo. It means you have done all of this boilerplate setup, all of that is a huge hurdle. It's so hard to do. So when you see somebody who's submitted their first patch, that's a person who you know is really passionate. They were passionate enough to overcome those hurdles. No matter how easy we make it, right? Like even though we have a script that does this stuff for you, it's still hard because it might not work, or there are peculiarities to your setup. So doing that makes you invested, right? When you set up your development environment and submit a patch, you've suddenly become invested in seeing the outcome of what it is you've worked hard to start. And especially when you get that patch accepted and it lands, and you can say to yourself, wow, I now have changed this shipping software. That gives you a feeling of agency. That gives you a feeling like, hey, this software isn't made by anonymous people somewhere else. It's made by people like me. All of a sudden, you start to identify with the developers. You start to think, I'm a developer, right? I worked on this. I have something in it. I'm a part of it. And now that you feel like you're a part of it, you feel like you're connected to other people in it. And maybe you like them. Maybe this acts as an encouragement for you to keep using it. And if you find a problem, maybe you're not just going to ditch the system now and say, oh, this sucks, I'm going to use something else. You now have the tools to start changing it. You see a problem and you don't have to complain about it or write a nasty post on social media. You can dig into the code and start fixing it. So like everything starts from there, right? Everything starts from people submitting their very first patch, not even a code patch, anything, because it gets them invested in the process. It makes them feel like they're a part of this thing. It makes them feel like they're in it. Because even if your tiny fix, to change one icon to another one, right? Or like correct a typo in an English piece of text, when you see that fix of yours in production and you're using it, it's like, that's amazing. It's incredible.
Yep.
Every person I've ever known who's had that experience, it's like, it's like a sugar high or something. It's amazing.
Well, you mentioned earlier about your wife running KDE Neon.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if we even talked about what you run. What do you run?
So I run OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, which is the rolling release version of the OpenSUSE distro.
All right. So
obviously the next question is, you use something different. Why don't the two of you use the same operating system, right?
Why don't you?
Yeah. So the reason why is because they're different things and they're targeted at different people. I don't use KDE Neon, or for that matter, any non-rolling release distro, because the development libraries that they include are usually just too old. Like, I like the latest version of libinput, for example, which is this input framework, and it's always getting better all the time. But the version of it that's shipped in KDE Neon is going to be the same version that's shipped in whatever Ubuntu release it's got. If I use Debian, it would be the same thing. Whereas with OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, I get the latest version immediately. So me personally, for my use cases, I like having the latest version of everything immediately. I'm even so crazy that I build all my KDE software from Git master every single day. So literally every day, I'm running on the latest version of all KDE software. I have like a Franken Gen 2 on my computer. That's how much I like being on the bleeding edge. But like, that's not a better or a worse thing than a person who wants a more stable experience, right? Because sometimes being on the bleeding edge involves bugs. Literally 2 days ago, an update to my computer rendered it unbootable. I think it might have been a firmware update through FWUpd, but I still don't know exactly what it was. It was an utterly terrifying experience, and I had to learn about the EFI shell to learn how to manually load EFI applications and, repair my bootloader. And like, that's not an experience I would recommend for my wife or my parents. But like, I tolerate that because I like living on the bleeding edge. Even though that was inconvenient, it was also kind of exciting too. So like, obviously there's a terrible bug here that needs to be fixed somewhere. But I'm comfortable experiencing that bug myself so that hopefully other people don't have to. And I think it's perfectly fine for people who want to run stable release distros that, have an unchanging version of everything for a few years, because they don't want to experience that sort of thing, and that's okay. That's fine. That's perfectly okay.
I have to say I'm in that class. So I appreciate the fact that you're willing to do that and like to do that. But me, I'm in that class of, man, I don't want to be there.
Yeah. And honestly, if I wasn't working on KDE for a living, I probably would be there too. Like if I was just a regular user of KDE software and I was just like, I had a job and I'm using it at home, but I'm a drive-by contributor, I would probably do that too. I probably would be running Neon or Kubuntu or, or something like that. But right now, the way it is, I have access to like the most amazing technical experts in the world. So whenever anything breaks, if I can't fix it, they can help me fix it real fast. And I feel like if I can save other people from that by experiencing it first, then that makes me happy.
Well, one of your blog posts that you had mentioned about your wife running KDE Neon, you mentioned the fact that most people don't want to fiddle with their computer.
Yep.
They just want to use it.
Yep.
So are we fighting? I know you're a desktop enthusiast, though. So are we fighting a losing battle of that, mythical year of the desktop?
So I think the answer is yes and no. I think about this constantly because since we've all started this, like since the time when I first used a Linux distro, smartphones appeared. And now the smartphone is like the basic unit of computing for an average everyday person. And so I think that to a certain extent, we have lost the year of the Linux distro for a regular person. But that's not because Linux lost. That's because desktop operating systems lost. We lost because everybody lost. People with no computer skills are just always going to want a tablet or a smartphone. I mentioned earlier that I like playing tabletop role-playing games, and one of them has a person's skills and stats measured in the form of dots. 0 dots is like no skill in this thing. 5 is like the biggest expert in the world. And to put things in those terms, I think people with 0 dots in computers were never a good fit for desktop operating systems in the first place. It's always been awkward for them. And when smartphones and later tablets appeared, they rapidly gravitated towards those because they fit their use cases better. But at the same time, that mythical basic user is not every user, right? Like, I know a number of people who fall into that category, but I also know a ton of people who don't. So it's absolutely worth continuing the desktop operating system for people who are a little bit beyond that, for people who, to use the same metaphor, have 1 dot in computers or 2 dots in computers. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan, but I feel like Star Trek had it exactly right. If you look at the kinds of devices that people use in Star Trek, right? When they're out on away missions, they pull out their tricorders and they use their communicators. These are basically the smartphones, right? Which shows us what smartphones are for. Smartphones are for like when you're out and about, they're for communication, and occasionally they're for like controlling other devices. Then when they're sitting at their desks or they're relaxing in their beds, they pull out their pads, which are basically, tablets. That shows us what tablets are for, right? Tablets are for recreation. They're for content consumption, and therefore very light content creation, and sometimes communication too. But then when the people on Star Trek need to get actual work done, right? Like when it's time to eject the warp core or preferably save the warp core or fire the photon torpedoes, what do? They use their consoles that are built into the wall because you need a real computer to do real work. And I think that's exactly right for our world, right? Like we all are going to have our smartphones, and they're going to be for communication, and they're going to be for controlling other devices, maybe occasionally. We're going to have our tablets for content consumption and relaxation, and we're going to have our computers for work because it's just the best environment for being productive and doing work. I mean, can you imagine like editing this podcast on a tablet, on a smartphone? I mean, it's silly to think about, right? Of course not. You would never want to do that. Even if there was software that allowed you to, the richness of the input devices that you get in a desktop is something you just couldn't have there. You're still going to be jabbing at it with your finger, you're not going to be very fast.
Yeah.
And so I think we're never going to have the year of the Linux desktop for like ordinary people, but we're absolutely going to have the year of the Linux desktop for productive people who use their computers to create, to innovate, to make money. that kind of stuff. I see that coming, and I think it's going to happen.
That is a fantastic answer. I
Thank
love
you.
this. I love the Star Trek correlation. And you know, it's funny because, you know, you think of these so many different ways. Like that question has gone in so many different directions from everybody that has answered that. And, you know, looking back over all of the answers, it's fantastic to see how people's minds work and how they think about the, you know, the thought process of what they put into the answers. It's awesome. And I love that.
I think maybe, you know, the next question would be, well, how do we get there? You know, even for creators and technical people. And I'm a very firm believer that we're never going to get there until you can get Linux pre-installed on hardware that you can walk into Best Buy and purchase. That's why I focus on this so hard. I think the KDE Slimbook that we just helped to the KDE the Slimbook people to do is really important because, you know, even if like maybe that's not the perfect laptop for everybody, right? But it'll be the perfect laptop for some people, and they'll buy it, and then they won't have to install Plasma themselves. And like that's the goal, right? The goal is for people to be able to buy the hardware. That's the product. The operating system really is not the product for most people, because even if you're technical and you can install your own OS, if your time is valuable, you don't want to do that, right? You just want to get going immediately. You don't want to fiddle around with stuff. As I said earlier, you want to just have it work out of the box. And for that to work, the box has to include it. You have to have it installed on the hardware that's in the box.
Well, we talked about it the other day in the community where, you know, we are in such a great time as far as hardware is concerned, because you have all of these companies come out, you know, like you mentioned Slimbook, and then you have System 76 and Tuxedo Computers, and you go down the list. And, you know, I have a Kubuntu Focus with me right now, checking it out.
Even the big manufacturers, Dell sells Linux on some of their computers. Lenovo announced that they're going to be doing it soon.
Yep. Well, the question always comes up, well, I wouldn't want that one because of this. But what I was trying to say was the fact that they have this is awesome. So like you said, with the Slimbook, it may not fit everybody, but it will fit some people. Same way with the Kubuntu Focus. It's not for everybody, but it will fit some people really well. And you can go down that list. And when you add all of that up and put that together, we are in a great time.
It is. And the people who buy those things are expanding the market so that more options can appear. You know, I see a lot of parallels between those and electric cars right now, because people sometimes say, oh, you know, I can't have an electric car because there isn't one that fits my needs. And that's probably true. But the more people whose needs are met by them, who buy them, that makes the market bigger. And then new ones come out, and maybe there will be an electric station wagon for you, right? Maybe there will be, you know, the electric sports car and the electric pickup truck. It's like the same thing for Linux laptops, right? Like if we support them, they'll come.
Yep. Well said.
Thank you.
Well, you told us the reasons why you chose to run Linux initially. Are they the same reasons that you choose to run Linux today?
Yeah, I think so. The original reason why I wanted to was so that I could be a part of a project that was helping to advance desktop usability. That was true back then. That's still true now. I have to say the experience of running Plasma has gotten more pleasant and better over time than it was before. You know, there were certain things that annoyed me that took a while to get fixed. Now, most things are really good in the way I want them. So it's only gotten better and easier, you know, I would say.
All right. So if you could have a magic wand and you could change anything in Linux right now, but you could only change one thing, what would it be?
I would have KDE Plasma shipped on a distro in every piece of hardware in every store in the world.
Wow.
Just that. Only that one thing.
That's a big magic wand.
Yeah. You know, you got to think big if you want big, right?
Right. Hey, hey, I gave you that opportunity, you know, whatever you want. So
you didn't have any caveats there. So
nope. That's awesome, dude.
That's the goal. That's what I want. I mean, that is, I will feel successful in my life's purpose if I can walk into Best Buy and walk out with a computer that has KDE Plasma on it.
That would be an awesome day.
That's what I want out of my whole life right now. That's my life's work. I feel like what I'm doing right now is my life's work.
Yep.
You know, I've always been a computer person. I always knew I wanted to work in the computer industry, but I didn't really gain a sense of like cosmic purpose until I discovered Linux and KDE. And having been given that purpose, I'm going to go all in until I get there, or, you know, get buried 6 feet under.
All in or bust. All right, Nate, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, I've got my email address, which is nate@kde.org, and there's a contact me link on my website. Those are probably the best ways if you want to contact me personally. I'm always on KDE's internal chat rooms all the time, and in the KDE Devel room a lot, the KDE VDG room. So if you are already involved in KDE, you can see me in all those different places. And otherwise, feel free to email me or contact me on your website if you have any questions or just want to talk about stuff.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me, but I want to thank you also, Nate, for the countless hours that you have put in to the KDE project, but not only the KDE project, but Linux and the community and us as users.
Thanks.
Your work has been fantastic. I love the fact that you want to promote the bond and the bridge between the community and the developers. I love the fact that you have a visual eye for things, that you want to improve that. There are so many things that I could list, but I just want to say thank you.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. It's nice to feel appreciated. And thank you very much for the compliment. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for joining me again. It was a great conversation that maybe we did more than once because of some technical difficulties.
A little deja vu here.
But
well, I would like to thank you for that. Thank you for your patience and for inviting me on this show. And thank you for doing it twice.
Right? Well, we won't mention about the .move issues that we had, but
yeah.
All right. That's going to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us this week as we spotlight the best thing about Linux, our community. Until next time, long live Linux.